Okay. All right, I'm going to minimize the panelists so I don't have to be distracted by their beautiful faces while I'm talking. Today, I'm going to be talking about the uncontrollable bias of advocacy. This is work with, there we go. David Melnikoff is also a panelist, and today, this is a standard disclaimer. Everything that you don't like about the talk, you should blame on David, as he's the one who's responsible for all the bad things, and then all the praise could be heaped on me. And again, that's just a standard disclaimer with all of my collaborators. So to orient us on what we're going to be talking about today, I'm going to go back into the history of philosophy for a classic debate. It's a Platonic dialogue between Gorgias, who was a rhetorician, and Socrates. And this debate basically goes like this. Gorgias says that when you serve as an advocate for someone, it's possible for you to both be a zealous advocate, passionately defending for your side, whilst also maintaining an objective assessment of truth. And you can hold both of these ideas in your mind simultaneously. Whereas Socrates says that's actually not that's not the case. To advocate for a side is necessarily to bias your judgments. And in modern terms, what we would say about this debate is that essentially the point of view that Gorgias is advocating for, or is arguing for, is that advocacy is a controlled process. Yes, sure, you could become biased, but you can take it back if you want. Whereas Socrates is saying, actually, it's automatic. You have no control over it. By the way, the first time I gave this talk, I put the wrong images of Gorgias in it, and then a philosopher had to come up to me afterwards to say, that was not Gorgias. That was just another picture of Socrates. So anyway, I found an actual picture of Gorgias, and as you can see, he is a bit of a snack as opposed to Socrates, who is a more kind of like non-traditional beauty. So, okay. You might be thinking now, just like sort of before we get into any kind of empirical investigations, maybe you have some skepticism about, you know, like maybe it's desirable to be biased, whether you can control it or not. And so I just thought that I would just sort of dispel this thought from the beginning, that really ideal advocacy is not just about having that bias, and that optimally you'd be able to do both, right? To nimbly shift between pursuing that zealous advocacy and being able to objectively evaluate the truth. And just to give one example, let's say that you're a defense attorney and you're trying to decide whether to accept a legal settlement. And the prosecuting side comes to you and gives you an offer where your client has to go to jail for some smaller number of years, for instance. Now, if you're really biased, that might prevent you from seeing how poorly the court case is going and whether it would actually be the optimal decision for your client to take the settlement. So ideally, you would be able to switch off that bias and be able to see, like, well, how are things going? How are people perceiving the client? How well is this argument proceeding? Just another example, it's not a courtroom example, but some empirical evidence to this effect. Biased advocates are more likely to get stuck at an impasse in negotiations. So the more bias you have when you're arguing for your side, the less likely you are to agree at a mutually agreeable resolution. You can see why that would be, right? Because both sides would think that the other side was offering something unfair. So it would be nice if you could switch back into that objective role. And you don't even have to think about this in terms of like the ethical considerations, right? Of course, it would also be ethically desirable to not be highly biased and presenting a biased point of the view to others, but even just at a purely self-interested level, ideally you should be able to maintain clear eyes about the cause that you're arguing for. Okay, so a little bit about automaticity. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about this, but just enough to orient you. There's a famous book chapter by John Barge where he says, okay, actually 4 horsemen of automaticity. And what he means by that is there's 4 dimensions, really, 4 ways that it can manifest: consciousness, intentionality, efficiency, and controllability. For the purposes of this investigation, we're going to be focused on that last one, the controllability dimension. So just so you know, so automaticity can mean a lot of things. Really, we mean specifically the controllability dimension for our purposes here. So if you want to determine whether a cognitive process is controllable, what should you do? What needs to be satisfied in terms of dimensions? There's 4 such hallmarks. One is the process should be easily evoked. So you can use a relatively small or minute stimulus, and you're still going to get that process to kick into gear. 2, it's something that should alter otherwise stable judgments. So judgments that don't move around very easily under normal circumstances. That would also be a hallmark of the controllability dimension. It should be insensitive to external reward. So for instance, if you offer someone a financial incentive or to pay them to not have the process happen, and it doesn't, and it still happens anyway, that's a good sign that it's not controllable. Also, it should be, if it's uncontrollable, insensitive to training effects. So I'll give you an example in visual cognition to just give you a sense of what I'm talking about. This is a famous optical illusion from Ted Dolson. The luminance of the A and the B square on this checkerboard pattern are identical, but no doubt when you look at this image, you see A as being darker than B. It doesn't matter how much money I pay you, right? I could say, I'm going to give you $1 million to see A and B as the same luminance. You're not going to see them as the same luminance. Maybe you'd lie and say, yes, I'm seeing them as the same luminance now, but your percept is not going to change. Similarly, no matter how many times you see this image and try to train yourself and psych yourself up to see the luminances as being the same, it doesn't matter. It's not a controllable automatic process. I have another visual illusion in here just because I like it, and not for any reason other than that. This is a kind of Mueller-Lyer illusion on crack. Hopefully you're seeing the animated GIF. My presenter notes here just say, fuck. Just because it's a very strong percept, right? That the little lines are waving, but if they're not. Again, it doesn't matter how much I were to pay you or how long you stared at this GIF, you're still going to see the optical illusion. And so what we're going to be looking at in this series of studies today is whether the advocacy bias is that same kind of uncontrollable bias. Okay, so to begin with, we're going to look at 2 of the hallmarks. The first hallmark, as you'll remember, is it's easily evoked. In order to do this, actually in all of studies, almost all of them, we use a very weak prime, which we're calling weak mere advocacy. And when I say mere advocacy, what I mean is we tell people you are going to serve, for instance, as the defense attorney or the prosecuting attorney, but we never actually have them perform the advocacy. A stronger prime would be they actually have to go through and perform the advocacy and do all the research and think about it for a long time and then go in and make the arguments. We don't have them do any of that. All we tell them is you are going to serve either as a defense attorney or prosecuting attorney, and then we ask them a bunch of questions, and then we say, oops, there's an error with the browser and you won't actually get to perform any of the advocacy, and then we sort of shuffle them on their way and pay them. Also in these studies, we look at judgments that should be very, very stable. We look at judgments that may be less stable, but as a crucial part of testing this hallmark, we look at an otherwise stable judgment, which is judgments of the true self. Now, when I say true self, what I mean is these are beliefs about who someone really is deep down. So you might, you can imagine, your favorite frenemy right now, someone who you think of is like, they are kind of a jerk usually, but when you press people and say, well, but really, who do you think this person is deep down inside? Most people will say, I still think they're a good person. This is a very, very robust effect. In all of the published literature, in fact, this effect pops up, where people think that the true self is good and positive, regardless of whether the kind of superficial features are like. And so we're going to look at those stable judgments to see if we can get those to change. I'm going to walk you through just a little bit of detail what our paradigm looks like, so I don't have to keep going over it, and you feel oriented towards it. Basically, what we usually do is we say, like, there's this person. This is Harrison. He's been accused of financial fraud and embezzlement. Now, the reason, just as like a little insider thing, we have been looking at white collar crime for a lot of these studies is because I'm in a business school, and this is a way for me to demonstrate that I'm at a business school. Is the crime is a white collar crime. So now he is the CFO of this made up company, and we say that basically he's been accused of embezzling this charitable donation, and we manipulate whether he actually is guilty or not. So did he actually embezzle this money that was going to the charity, or were there hackers who came in and made it look like that, but they actually stole money? So the participants, at least for this study, know factual guilt. That's one of our independent variables that's between subjects. And I'll just tell you right now, factual guilt doesn't matter. It doesn't interact with the effect. And so now you know. But another critical independent variable is the role that they get assigned to, which is, are they a prosecuting or defense attorney? And then our dependent variables are, we ask about the true self. Yeah. Now we ask about the true self in a couple of ways. Oh, yes.
I'd like to interrupt to tell you that Skyworks is actually a company, according to an attendee, and they might send you a cease and desist at some point.
Okay, cool. Well, it's good that this talk is being recorded and therefore will be available to the legal proceedings that inevitably result as, as a result of this Data Colada seminar. So I feel good about that. There should always be a paper trail. Was that the only question?
That was my fault, as Nina told you in the beginning.
Right. Oh, right. Yes. David will be the one going to jail. Okay. Moving on. The way that we ask about the true self is we do it in a couple of ways. Turns out not really to matter, but just so you know, you're going to see two true self-dependent measures, like pretty much throughout the talk, a categorical measure and a continuous measure. But basically the way we ask this is we give people examples like, well, Harrison helped an old lady cross the street one day. What do you think motivated that? Was that his true self, who he really was deep down, or is that just his kind of superficial self, not really who he is? And we ask that in a categorical way, like, true self or not, but then also on a Likert scale, to what extent was it his true self? And we also have this kind of global evaluation. This was meant to be our more flexible measure of person perception, which is basically like, how much do you like Harrison? How warm do you feel towards him? And that's a continuous measure. And as I mentioned, the subjects actually never perform the advocacy, right? So it's that weak prime. Now, to orient you towards the way I'm going to be presenting the data, I'm going to walk you through it a little bit so that I don't have to keep doing it. We are calculating the advocacy bias and putting it on this visualization as the standardized response in the prosecuting condition minus the defense condition, or the absolute value between them. So that's why we're seeing that. That's how the advocacy bias is going to be shown, is a standardized score, and then we have our true self measures and the global evaluation. Okay, so there you have it. There's our advocacy bias. So this is our first hint that the bias exists. And that it might not be controllable, right? Because we use a weak prime, and they're not, and the true self actually measure is flipping. And this I should point out again. I mean, this is something that only people who care about true self research will really care about. But the fact that we got these true self ratings to flip is kind of a big deal, and is sort of like kind of almost unheard of. Okay, so there's a few deflationary accounts I just want to get out of the way early on. The first is, you might think maybe this is just about seeing what it's like to be a defense attorney or a prosecuting attorney, being given that information and imagining it, but not actually about having the goal activated of I shall be a defense attorney, or I shall be a prosecuting attorney, right? I'm actually going to advocate.
Can I just cut in?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
So I'm not sure I fully understand how you computed advocacy bias, and I thought it would be good to clarify before we move on. So is this across both factual guilt conditions, so whether or not they were guilty?
Yes, because it's a standardized score. There would have been a way to show this as on two different figures. You would have seen the same basic pattern. I believe there's a main effect according to factual guilt, but it doesn't interact with the advocacy bias. Does that resolve the question?
Still not completely clear, but I think it might become clear if you.
This is the main effect of role, prosecuting versus defense, over factual guilt. So this is cutting across factual.
Okay.
This is the standardized size of the main effect of role. And when Nina said that we don't get an interaction, it's because this effect size is statistically equivalent across factual levels of fact guilt.
Got it. Thanks.
And
sorry.
No,
yeah, and if there was no advocacy bias, the mean would be 0. So no advocacy bias would be having those 95% confidence intervals overlap with that dotted line, as Colin asked.
Right. Yes.
You might get to this in a second, but is there a case where there's a baseline where you're not assigned a role and you're just observing the information? Is that what's coming next? Okay.
Oh, wow, Dorsa, this is so wonderful. I love that question. Yes, that is exactly this next study. So you're just told about, about the information, and you're told about, that someone is assigned as a defense attorney or prosecuting attorney, and then we ask the same set of questions, and we actually add a question. Because in the last study there was no effect of, it didn't really matter whether the person was factually guilty or not. In this case, for this study, we don't stipulate factual guilt, and instead we ask about it. So, so we switch it from an independent variable to a dependent variable, because we wanted to get a sense of, like, is this also biasing not just interpersonal evaluations, but also, do you think the person is factually guilty of the thing they're accused of? So what I'm showing here is, I believe this is just for the prosecuting side. Were you assigned to the role of prosecuting attorney, or were you merely shown the information that the prosecuting attorney saw? And we still see an advocacy bias, right? The deflection from 0. And it's not just for these evaluations of who this defendant is, but also it's reflected in how much jail time you think the person should get if they're found guilty. And to put this into human terms, since this is like a Z-score, this turns out to be about 3 more years in prison that you recommend in the prosecuting attorney role, as opposed to just seeing the information that the prosecuting attorney sees.
Hey, Nina, what is the difference between true self A and true self B?
Is it binary or continuous measure?
Okay. A is which one?
I forget.
Okay, got it. Okay.
A is continuous. A is continuous.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I should remember that with B for binary.
There you go.
It'll help me in the future. But yeah, it doesn't matter. In almost every study, they basically look the same. Almost every study. Okay. Another possible deflationary account is, like, maybe there's some sort of demand effect, right? This is a bit leading. Maybe people are just giving us the answer that we're seeking because we're sort of feeding them information on, like, well, that as a prosecuting attorney, everything that you do as a prosecuting attorney is, like, against someone. And so then when I ask you, do you hate them? You say yes. And vice versa. So we ran a modified version that takes on a police interrogation kind of paradigm that inverts the demand effect. So what it means to advocate for the defendant is you have to derogate them, right? They're basically saying, like, what are you, crazy? Your reputation will ruin forever if you confess. Don't confess, right? Because to properly represent the client, you want to prevent them from confessing. And in most cases, confessing to a crime results in prosecution, unless of course, you're living in the Trump administration, but that's neither here nor there. And I promised myself I wasn't going to make this political. And then vice versa for if you're advocating against the defendant, because that would mean praising them in order to coax them into a confession, right? Like, oh, you know, we all make mistakes. It's not a big deal, you know, in order to basically trick them into confessing. So when we invert at least the apparent demand.
Nina?
Yes, yes.
Can I just add one more thing to this? This manipulation, to confirm that people understood this inversion, we asked people to indicate what sort of phrases they should say as part of their role later on. And one of the phrases was, oh, you're, you know, just because you did this doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Deep down, you're a good person. And it was the defense attorneys who said, I shouldn't say that. And it was the interrogators who said, yeah, I should say that. So everyone understood that what they should do in their role, what they should say, is the exact opposite of what it was in that previous study.
Right. So great. So we are specifically having them in inhabiting their role saying the opposite thing about the person's true self, at least for some of those prompts. Which makes our findings even more, in a way, surprising, right? We're still able to find this effect, including in the true self judgments. Okay, so it is unlikely to just be a result of experiment or demand. Also, relatedly, you might be wondering if people are aware that they're being biased, right? So maybe what people are doing is they are employing a conscious strategy. They're saying, well, yeah, like I know I'm being biased, but I don't care. I know that to be biased is to, you know, effectively advocate for my client. So it'll be important for us to know, like, are they actually aware of it? Or is this something that's kind of bypassing awareness? We do this in a couple of ways for this new study. One is we give them these repeated, explicit reminders to be unbiased, where we say, remember, be unbiased in your assessment when you give your answer to this. We say that on every page. We also give them an opt-out option, right? So we say, listen, if you don't feel that you can be unbiased, skip these questions. Now you'll note that this is a particularly, since these studies are run online, this is a particularly strong way to just, because people could just choose to say, like, I don't want to answer these questions, so I'll just press the skip button. We're allowing them just to have an easy way out of answering the questions. So in this sense, I think a particularly strong measure of, like, you know, so what do we find about these people who nonetheless say, no, I know I can be unbiased in answering these questions. And just so you know, 87% of people opt in. They say, I will answer all the questions, and I'm, you know, and in so doing, believe they're unbiased, and 13% of people opt out. So the data that I'm about to show you is for that 87% of people who opted in and responded to the questions.
Did you also explicitly ask them, how biased do you think you were?
David, did we ask them about how biased they thought they were? I think it was just binary.
No, what we do is just say, it's known that this has the potential to bias you. It's extremely important that you avoid that bias. And so if you think that there's any chance that you're biased, please don't answer the questions. So a question like the one that you're suggesting would be potentially nice as an additional manipulation check. Based on the instructions, everyone who answers the question should say, I'm completely unbiased, because we said any inkling of bias, you should just skip. So
anything more than 0, yeah.
Right, I think it just would have been really nice to be able to compare the ratings in that group of people who eventually opt out versus those who opt in.
Yeah, that would be,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because that you could imagine there being a null effect there. You could also imagine there being some effect, right? Maybe having some inkling that you're biased. I mean, that even could go either way, right? Where if you think you're biased, maybe you do an overcorrection, or maybe not. But I don't think we have a sense of that. And we do ask about awareness in a couple other studies as well. But I don't think they would be able to speak to that particular, like, is a level of awareness, does that track like the level of the bias in one direction or the other? Yeah.
What I love about this particular manipulation is that if anyone here has actually served on a jury, for instance, this is the one that we have culturally evolved in the legal system to really like play a central role in how we make these decisions. So the judge will explicitly tell you, people make biased decisions, your job is to be unbiased. And so it's really interesting to show that this really doesn't seem to be that effective.
Yeah, funny that. Right. So ultimately, what I'm hoping to get to is just a complete decimation of the American judicial system, but that's perhaps a project for after tenure. Okay. So participants seem to be unaware of the bias, and I should also point out the magnitude of the effect in this study and many of the other studies that don't contain this instruction is no different. Okay. All right. So third hallmark, something about a cognitive process that is controllable should be sensitive to external rewards. If it's uncontrollable, then if you financially incentivize it, for instance, in terms of accuracy or for responses overall, then you should be able to move it around. So in this new study, subjects are they're not told whether the defendant is factually guilty. They're only given evidence to evaluate and told that those who guess correctly are going to be awarded a $10 bonus. Now, this evidence that they're evaluating are those same questions about the true self. So like, here's something that Harrison did, and what do you think of that? So this kind of cleverly ends up folding in our true self DVs. And we give them this, absolutely princely $10 bonus if they guess correctly. Now, as a matter of fact, there is no truth of the matter, right? In this, there is no reality of who Harrison's true self is. Of course, we still award a bonus, but we are at least trying to incentivize accuracy. Anyway, so we still find this advocacy bias even when we provide a financial incentive to be unbiased. And that's true for the interpersonal evaluations. It's also true for your assessment of what do you think? Was Harrison really guilty or not? And again, because Harrison is a fictional character, there actually isn't an outcome. But we're still seeing a bias, right? Where if you are on the prosecuting side, you're more likely to say that my best guess for his factual guilt is higher than what the prosecuting attorneys suggest.
Nina?
Yes.
Oh, so did you ever manipulate the strength of the incentive, or how plausible they thought it might be that there was actually a truth of the matter? The reason being, it may just be a cost worth paying to seem like your arguments you believe in your arguments, and therefore your arguments are more credible.
Well, okay, there's a couple ways you could think about that. One is that would be a hell of a price to pay. We're paying you $1 to take the study, and you're rejecting a chance of a $10 bonus just to be right about this fictional character. We, to the extent that this helps assuage the worry, we run this study, basically a version of this study on real lawyers, and we give them a much higher bonus. One person gets a $200 bonus. So that feels more like real money. But maybe you could argue, well, to a lawyer, $200 is nothing, right? That's 15 minutes. The lawyer studies were very expensive. But yeah, do we manipulate the plausibility, or do we measure the plausibility? I don't think we do.
Nina's going to show you a study later on that makes the plausibility of one particular answer or another pretty clear. It's not manipulated within the study, but it's manipulated between studies. In addition, there's a subtle way in which we inform people about this bonus that I think might help assuage your concern, in addition to what Nina already mentioned, which is the following. Participants were told not only that they have to answer correctly whether he's innocent or guilty in order to win a $10 bonus, they were additionally told that if they fail to answer it correctly, they would not even be able to advocate in the first place. So in order to advocate, they had to get this correct. So both the goal to be a good advocate and a goal to win $10 would were aligned in the sense that they both would motivate people to give a correct answer to this question.
Okay.
I mean, I'll also say that we we tried to find real cases because we thought, well, that would be better. It turns out that when you're trying to go into court record archives, it's like it's a mess, and it's not as easy as it sounds to come up with, like, to find a real case and where you actually have enough details about it to give people both that it's kind of equivocal, you know, whether the person is guilty or not, and whether that you have access to the outcome and all the relevant evidence. The record keeping in court systems is not as good as I thought it was. I was basically laughed at when I approached some courts about looking at their records. There was laughter involved. So we did try. I don't know how much of an A I get for effort on that, but we did try. But that would be something, I mean, you know, always the gold standard would be like something where there's like just full ecological validity. And of course, the advantage of the way that we've been doing this is, first of all, we can control the features much more, but also if it's not real, then there's no chance that any of our participants know about it, which is also something we were potentially worried about, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so let's move on. Now, sometimes people ask me about, well, like, because I'm not actually giving evidence, really, that points in any one direction or the other to the person's guilt, their factual guilt. And so we've run studies where we give people a bit more evidence that pushes them onto one side or the other. So in this study, participants are told, you know, there's this fuzzy video footage that this artificial intelligence has looked at and determined there's a 60% chance that the defendant is the one who's in this footage, and it's a footage of someone breaking in and stealing things. So it's a theft crime. And so you think that, especially if this is the only evidence you have, like, that's really going to push you on the side of, you know, this person probably did it. Right, it's actually indicating, in a way, it's indicating more than 60% guilt that they did it. It's saying it's a 60% chance that the person in the video, of all the people in the world, is that individual. But, you know, maybe there's enough plausible deniability that if you don't want to believe that, you can kind of opt out from believing that. We also financially incentivize this study. So we say, if you guess correctly about whether the person actually did it, you will get the bonus. But we find in judgments of guilt, there's still the advocacy bias. And just to drive home this point, this is the same figure that I showed you in purple that I showed you on the last slide. When I first was making these slides, I was like, wait a minute, how did I accidentally copy the two things at the same? No, there's actually, like, I mean, this is to a certain extent a coincidence, but the same degree of bias, and as it happens, is just the means on these z-scores, or they're not z-scores, but on these standardized scores are the same, according to whether we gave people evidence for factual guilt or no evidence at all, which is really quite striking. Okay. So something you might be thinking is an obligatory Simpsons reference. Well, we all advocate for things every day, but it's not, generally speaking, in a professional context. We're asking people to pretend that they are an attorney, but very few of these participants on MTurk are actually practicing attorneys. And it might be the case that if you went to a real set of lawyers who actually practice and are trained, that this effect would go away. When we were initially trying to recruit lawyers to the study, I went to a few law firms and to pitch them the study idea, hoping that I could distribute the studies to the law firms, and not realizing that, well, of course, lawyers love paperwork and they love to make things difficult. And so they wanted me to, sign some like 100-page contract, or have all the lawyers sign the 100-page contract in order to actually use them. So we didn't end up going directly to law firms. But nonetheless, the lawyers that I spoke to were very confident that they would not show this bias, right? These are just naive subjects who are not trained in the law. Also, the lawyers were extremely confident that there would be these giant differences between defense attorneys and prosecuting attorneys, like that there's something about the nature of a prosecuting attorney that makes them, more shark-like and aggressive, and the nature of a defense attorney is that they're, more soft and pliant, and then we're probably going to find these gigantic effects on what kind of attorney it is. They're just going to blow out of the water my piddling little survey, right? So I was very curious to know, like, were the lawyers right? They were certainly very confident. We went to a panel company that recruited lawyers for us. And just to remind you, another reason for doing this is to kind of sew up this fourth hallmark of controllability. So if you're trained to be unbiased and retain and both do the zealous advocacy whilst retaining that objective assessment of the truth, if anyone should be able to do it right, it's the lawyers. Now, you might just be wondering, are lawyers actually trained to have that Gorgian ideal? And we asked our lawyers this, right? Do you agree, yes or no, with the following statements? 86% of them agreed with both of these statements. During my academic and/or professional training as a lawyer, I learned to make objective, unbiased assessments of the cases before me. And during my academic and/or professional training as a lawyer, I learned to prevent my own personal biases from coloring my legal judgment, right? So they're not just saying I can remain unbiased, but this is actually an explicit part of my training. In informal conversations with lawyers that I know, they've also told me this is both a bit part of law school, but it's really a big part of your early days in law firms. This is how we're going to train you in how to be unbiased and retain that objective assessment of the truth. And now this is kind of backed up empirically as well. Okay, so in this study that I'm going to show you, what we did with our lawyers, who, as I think I mentioned, are very expensive, we gave them a case brief about a company that's suing an employee for selling trade secrets. And we asked them a variety of questions. We asked about, the defendant's true self. Do you think they're factually guilty? If they are found guilty by the court, what is their amount of liability? Should there be an injunction put out against this client? And also, if they're found guilty, how much in damages should they have to pay? Right, so all sorts of potential kind of downstream consequences of being biased in favor of or against this client. Okay, and so here are our findings. We find an advocacy bias on every single one of these measures, whether it's a measure of who the client is, or their level of guilt, or how much they should be punished for the crime they've been accused of. Now, some features of this, in addition, the defense attorneys thought that the employee should pay 27% of the $8.5 million sought, versus the prosecuting attorneys who thought he should pay about half. So this is a gigantic, in terms of real dollars, what they're recommending, millions of dollars in difference. The lawyer's training, either the number of years that they've been training or what their specialty is. So if they're prosecuting or defense attorney, for instance, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. We've run a follow-up study where we offer a financial incentive. I alluded to this before. We say, if you guess correctly about what happened in this case, we will give you $200, or you'll enter into a lottery to win $200. That doesn't eliminate the bias either. Importantly, I mean, and maybe this isn't important. I mean, I think it's striking. We don't find any difference in the magnitude of the advocacy bias between these trained legal professionals and the naive subjects. So not only are we seeing the bias in these participants, the lawyers, we're not even seeing a reduction in bias. Well, we're not seeing an increase in the bias either, but there's just no difference, which again is a really strong evidence for training not having an effect, and more kind of generally this being an uncontrollable cognitive bias. Okay, so just to kind of bring us back to this original question, about Socrates versus Gorgias, it looks like Socrates was right, resoundingly so. Now, this is not unusual for Socrates. Usually seems that he seems to be right about everything, but this is no exception. There's a few more things that I'd like to talk about regarding the cognitive mechanism. Now, this is a picture of us taking a deeper dive, and you'll note that we're wearing business suits because, you know, of our professionalism. Right. So why would we want to identify the cognitive mechanism? One reason is just because, you know, we have a passion for JDM, and so of course we want to know the cognitive mechanism behind this. But another more pragmatic reason is, you know, to the extent that we have a handle on what the nature of this cognitive mechanism is, we'll have a better sense of how to intervene, right? How to make it so that we're not vulnerable to this cognitive bias. Now, I'll point out, there's a few things we already know about the cognitive mechanism of the advocacy bias, right? Based on the preceding studies that I've been showing you. And I'll just recap them. One, we know that this bias is insensitive to external rewards. We know that it's insensitive to training effects. Certainly the training effects that are usually employed are not effective against them. People seem to be unaware of it, right? So, and this is the ordinary folk and the lawyers alike. And we've measured that awareness in a few different ways. And as Jesse pointed out, there might be kind of finer grained ways we could get at it. But certainly in the broadest strokes, people do seem to be unaware of this bias. So one question we could ask about the mechanism, this is a very basic kind of question, is how broad is it? Does it appear in other domains? Or, you know, maybe this is just a problem for the lawyers, right? Or for legal advocacy, but not advocacy more generally. And we've only just begun to look at this, but we do have some evidence for whether this advocacy effect appears in other domains. So this is a study in the political domain where participants are assigned to the role of a campaign manager for one political candidate or another. So they're told, you know, you're either for or against this candidate as the campaign manager. And then, yes.
Yeah, a question from the audience that I was also wondering about, and this is a good point in this study to ask it. How exactly do you tell people, how do you randomly assign them to a role? Like how come they're defending one side or the other? What do they learn?
So we tell them that, so first of all, we tell them about both sides, right? You know, in the justice system. Now I sound like the Law and Order opening, but there, you know, there's the defense and the prosecuting side. So we tell them about both sides, and we tell them that they are going to be randomly assigned to one. So they don't somehow think that there was some reason that they got one side or the other. At least they have no reason to think that. They know that they could have been assigned to either side of what is what's portrayed to them as basically a game, like a lawyer game. And then, I mean, and in this political version as well, I mean, I actually think it's particularly interesting in this case. Well, it's actually interesting in both cases, right? Because with lawyers and with if you're a campaign manager, the reality generally is that if a client comes to you, you take them on, and they come to you not because you select them, but because they select you. Campaign managers are also in many ways often mercenaries in this same sense, right? Where listen, if you give me a big enough paycheck, yes, I will. I will work for your side, and your personal views need not come into it. It's an interesting question. I mean, and I think there's actually a deeper question lurking here, which is once you leave the courtroom or once you leave your job, go home, and you have your personal private views, how much have those been adulterated basically by taking on this role? And I think one possible conclusion of this data, right, is to think that these two domains do not remain separate, and that you really probably do begin to believe your own hype. Even if you're being paid for it, and even if you understand that it's been randomly assigned to you, which I think is one of the more disturbing conclusions of these results. But
Nina, related
anyway.
to that,
Yes.
Nina, related to that, have you ever thought about giving them subsequently, say, information about a new case that they don't have to advocate for, but it's kind of a similar crime, and see?
We thought, yeah. Okay. We thought about it. We haven't done it. Yeah. Right, and then so that would sort of perhaps separate two possibilities of what might be going on, right? One thing that might happen is just that there's bleed over because you were thinking in this general purpose way about how to approach cases like this. But another possibility is that it's specific to the client. If I had to guess, I would think it would be the former, not the latter, that bleed through would be very broad. But we don't know.
Yeah,
and you can imagine, you know, like, yeah.
I was going to say, if that were true, it would also help to rule out some other possible explanations that some people might be worried about. Like I really feel compelled in this experiment to take on this specific role of advocacy against, like you assigned me to this team, and so I feel like I have to be a member of this team. But if you found that it bled over to things that aren't part of that role, which I also think you'd probably find, then it wouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, and then it gets at like these other things having to do with maybe your personal identity, right? So let's say you're like a Gloria Allred type attorney, and you know your reputation is built on making certain kinds of bringing certain kinds of cases into court, and then you get a new client, or you see, or even if you just see a new case, it's not even your own. Because your identity potentially or approach is like kind of tied up in, you know, I'm the sort of person who represents clients in this way. That also might suggest, even though it's not, you know, in any way your duty to advocate in this way, you might still think it's the case.
Yeah, and it seems to me that with the worry, I think the best data about the worry that people may be just really saying, you know what, screw all these incentives, I just really want to take on this role. I think those data where we allow people just to not, at no cost, to just skip over questions that they feel like they might be biased after imploring them to do exactly that. It's not only no cost, but they actually get a benefit. I mean, they get through the study faster if they skip these things. I would say that that's our best case against something like you're saying. The second best case is just that I guess Nina and I would want to say that it's implausible that people were that committed to the roles relative to the possibility of a $10 reward. Yeah.
Yeah, but I still
think it's possible, but that would be our case.
I don't know, that's not going on in my household, I can assure you. Okay, so let's move on. I mean, I think that's a great suggestion though. And we have a kind of more ambitious ultimate goal of like running studies where we really put a lot more meat on the bones and like have people assessing evidence. And is this, you know, is this just impacting how you, judge the client, or is it also impacting like how you would take in information to begin with, right? There's a lot, this is a really kind of rich set of study questions here that like we are just like kind of very, very much just beginning to dig into. But I mean, you probably know what I'm about to show you, but I'll just, you can pretend that you're wondering whether we find an advocacy effect in politics. Oh, and I should say that aside from having that duty of the true self, we also say that they can basically reduce part of their own bonus, so costly punishment, in order to punish a political candidate that political candidate was found to have been cheating, or do they want to use it to protect the scandal? So you could see it as an analog for political scandal, but we see the advocacy bias also in this political context. There's a few things you could take away from this. One is the advocacy bias does not appear to be limited to legal reasoning. We're also seeing it in this political context. It's already kind of well established in social psychology that, you know, there are a variety of pervasive biases in how one evaluates not just one's own political candidates, but it looks like now also a political candidate that you might just arbitrarily be assigned to, regardless of whether they're you have any additional reasons to defend them, right? Because you agree with them or you want to see them in power for any reason other than you've just been arbitrarily assigned to that side. I'll say this, I feel always a little self-conscious mentioning this. One thing that David and I are interested in is how this might also extend to scientific advocacy. So there is not just an adversarial system in politics, right? There's also an adversarial system in science. And I have heard informally many of my colleagues say that this adversarial system where, there's two people who have their two theories that they passionately defend in print, and that, like, no matter what, right? I mean, and I think some of the people who are on this panel have, like, been involved in these kind of, like, back and forths, right, in print, and I have as well, where you defend your side. And many people argue that that adversarial system that we have set up in science is good. Why is it good? Because it helps us come to truer conclusions in the end, maybe more quickly. It's efficient, and perhaps through some kind of alchemy, having two sides being very biased somehow speeds us along towards the correct answer scientifically. But that's an empirical question in itself. And I'm not convinced that's the case. I don't think that we have very clear a priori reasons for thinking that. It might be the case that scientific advocacy in this adversarial system in science is detrimental. If both sides are a bit blind, perhaps neither side is really going to be seeing the truth. And at the very least, they'll be overconfident. But I'm just throwing that out there. I have we haven't run any direct studies on this. It is something that I've been thinking about, in the context of this. And I realize there's kind of like a meta dimension of this, because I am making an argument to you, right? Which is that this is a cognitive bias and that it's uncontrollable, and I'm defending it. But we could question whether that adversarial system is really the optimal one for scientific progress. Okay. I was anticipating getting a question about this, and every time I've given this talk before, I've gotten this question. So no doubt it's something that at least some people are wondering about, which is maybe this is just a form of motivated reasoning. I don't think it would be bad if that were the case, but I think it would be important for us to know if it were the case. Is the advocacy bias another form of motivated reasoning, and therefore all motivated reasoning would also be uncontrollable in this same way? So to look at this, to test this, we use a very similar paradigm as before, but instead of being assigned this advocacy role, we just told them, you're going to be paid a bonus based on whether your side is correct, right? So you have some skin in the game, you have some reason to want your client to be guilty or not, or whether you want their true self to be good or not, but you're not actually assigned to the role. So that goal of advocacy is not activated in these participants. And we just ask about the true self. And now you're wondering if you're ever going to see a figure where 0 is near the middle of the scale. And we just find nothing here. It's just a completely null result for people who are in this motivated reasoning study. And if anything, what people might be doing is overcorrecting, right? So they're kind of maybe aware that they potentially are going to have a bias, and so they're shifting to the other side. But the results are null. And our conclusion from this is that while motivated reasoning appears to be controllable, at least in this case, the advocacy bias specifically is not controllable. So no doubt there are many kind of relationships or connections between the advocacy bias and something that we might call motivated reasoning, which is a pretty broad and nebulous term. But on the specific dimension of controllability, seems that what we are calling the advocacy bias is something that's not controllable, whereas motivated reasoning appears to be much more controllable. Okay, so in the remaining few minutes, we'll come back to this question: how do we get rid of this cognitive bias? Now, I don't have any definitive answers on this yet, but here's some thoughts. Because the bias is uncontrollable, and to a certain extent beyond awareness, the normal remedies that we might usually throw at cognitive biases aren't going to work. So self-regulation probably isn't going to work, right? Just telling people to be less biased. Throwing money at the problem probably isn't going to work. Training people probably isn't going to work, unless there's some specific type of training. But certainly the type of training that's generally employed for advocates does not seem to work.
Ina, sorry, we have 2 minutes.
Oh, yes. Well, it'll take me 2 minutes to finish talking. Is that okay?
Yes.
1.5 minutes, it looks like. Well, okay. So just very briefly, and again, I have nothing other than just sort of like Kantian pure reason to suggest that these things might work. One like inside the box solution is just external regulation, right? And it's the classic one. Just make it so that impartial third parties are in some way monitoring these biases, ones that don't have a stake in the outcome. Okay, that's a classic a way of monitoring. So a possible individual level solution, maybe we should move away from adversarial systems. Some legal systems in other countries are non-adversarial, right? That don't involve the prosecuting and the defense just putting forward the most zealous case that they can and battling it out in court and then hoping that justice somehow magically emerges from that. So that's a possible solution. Will it work? I don't know. Another possible solution that's even more individual level, even more psychological, is maybe all we need to do here. So maybe what's going on is some form of affective forecasting error, right? Where you think you're going to feel a certain way before you're assigned to the role, and then you end up feeling a different way, and so you adjust your views accordingly. And so maybe if we just induce uncertainty, right? You'll remember that those lawyers were very confident, like most people, very confident. If we could make them feel less confident about the outcomes, maybe people would be less biased potentially. Okay, well that's all I have, and thank you very much for listening. The end.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nina.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who attended. There were lots of great questions that we didn't get to, and we're going to pass those off to Nina and David. So really appreciate everyone's participation. Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.